Guantanamo Bay has been open for 8 years. The controversial detainment camp employs questionable interrogation tactics like torture and waterboarding and continues to hold 196 suspected terrorists, many of whom have never been charged with a crime. President Obama vowed to shut down the detainment camp, but the deadline came and went with little progress. Well, Christine Husky represents many detainees from Guantanamo Bay. She's an author of the book Justice at Guantanamo and is a professor at the National Security Clinic at the University of Texas Law School. She joins me now. Christine, thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
First of all, I want to ask you, you're a former actress and model. Some people would say that you're the least likely person to want to represent detainees at Guantanamo Bay. Why have you made this your personal mission?
It really was, well, sort of going back to the modeling and the acting. I mean, I was sort of caught up in the New York lifestyle, and it took going to college to get me out of that, and a class I took called Civil Liberties and Civil Rights that sort of inspired me to go to law school. And it was, you know, at law school taking a lot of classes, and afterwards taking on the representation of Guantanamo detainees really reminded me why I went to law school, because I went to a big law firm directly afterwards, like many law students do, in the private sector, and enjoyed that for several years. But taking on the representation reminded me why I went to law school to begin with. So.
And I've read that, you know, you have said that some people have accused you of being unpatriotic because of your work, and some have even said that you should be sent to Guantanamo Bay for some of the work that you've done. What do you think when people say things like that, and why do you think so many Americans think like that?
Well, I could say that I think it was understandable right after 9/11. You know, people were really afraid of you know, I was in New York on 9/11, so of course that was, you know, it was a terrible time, and so I think that fear, you know, was inspired by fear, and I think honestly that politicians sort of perpetuated the fear. So people said that out of fear. Nowadays, when people say it, I really don't understand it, and I honestly think that sort of, you know, deep inside there's still a little bit of fear about what might happen, and that I think is also what's driving the Obama administration's national security policy. There's that constant fear of what might happen if we give too many rights or too many liberties.
But, you know, speaking of rights, many people have said, hey, these guys are enemy combatants and they shouldn't have any rights. I mean, what do you think about that?
I think what's interesting is a lot of people say they shouldn't have any rights. They shouldn't even get a process with rights to, you know, to determine whether they're enemy combatants. But that obviously is sort of a confused analysis. If you're going to say they don't get any rights because they're terrorists, then you're just basically denying them any process at all. And the whole point is to give them some sort of hearing, which is fair, to determine whether they're a terrorist or not, right? So we can't assume that they're a terrorist until we've had some fair process.
In 2008, you experienced a major victory in front of the Supreme Court when it ruled that detainees at Guantanamo Bay could have a chance to challenge their detention. But at the same time, there have been many setbacks, like President Obama's vow to shut down Guantanamo Bay. A year passed, his deadline came and went, and there was no progress. What keeps you going?
That's a very good question. I will say, you know, in my book, at the end, I end with the promise to shut down Guantanamo, and I sort of end with this feeling of hope. And that, you know, that was a year ago, and I wrote that chapter a year ago. And I have to tell you, my feelings of hope have sort of diminished, and I would say, to quote a friend of mine, Obama's promises of change have, you know, atrophied into just empty rhetoric, because Guantanamo is still there. But frankly, in so many ways, I blame not only the Republicans, but also the Democrats as well, who voted in Congress to restrict funding for shutting Guantanamo down, to put many obstacles in the way of transferring Guantanamo detainees out of Guantanamo, even to the United States for prosecution, to restrict funding for transferring them to their own home countries. So you've got a lot of pushback against the Obama administration for shutting Guantanamo down. You know, Guantanamo itself is not so much the problem, other than the fact the impression it has left on the international community in particular. But what really is the problem is the lack of laws that might be applied. So, for example, when Guantanamo first opened, and the reason why it has such a bad name is because no laws applied there, and they weren't entitled to hearings until this recent victory, and they weren't entitled to international laws, and Bush withheld that. Now, so if we transfer those detainees to Thompson, Illinois, which is a possibility, and we withhold the same laws from them, then all we're doing is moving Guantanamo to the U.S., and so we haven't really shut down Guantanamo. And similarly, if we keep Guantanamo open, but we give them fair hearings, and we give them all the opportunities that they're entitled to under the law and the rights that they're entitled to, then in many ways it may not matter where they are. It's really about what rights they get and applying the law.
And you kind of touched on this already, but why don't you think the Obama administration, and maybe specifically President Obama, hasn't fulfilled the promise of, shutting down Guantanamo Bay when he said he would? Many of his critics say that he's continuing those Bush-era policies, as you mentioned, of, those torture and interrogation tactics and things that he had spoken out about so much.
Yes, he did. He ran his campaign on shutting Guantanamo and ending torture, and really doing a lot of finger pointing at the Bush administration. And I'll say I'm deeply disappointed that he has not fulfilled those promises. Maybe that's what politicians do, but that's that's just disappointing. Really, the practical question is what to do with the people who are there. I mean, as you said, there's roughly 200 people there. I will tell you about 100 or so have been cleared for transfer by the Obama administration. Many of them are Yemenis, and because of the recent Christmas bombing, or the Undi bomber, he put a hold on any transfers back to Yemen. So that's sort of, maybe that was a good idea because of the reality, but maybe that wasn't such a good idea, right? There's another 35 that will be prosecuted in military commissions or in federal court. There's another 50 that have been designated as unsuitable for release, and they want to continue to detain them. And the question is, where? If we shut down Guantanamo, they won't be there. But if there's restrictions on transferring them out of Guantanamo, then that's a problem as well. So it's a real predicament.
And you've had firsthand experience with these detainees, and you've gone to Guantanamo several times. What would you want the average person to know about them or Guantanamo that they might not know from what they've seen on TV?
Well, I'll tell you, one of the first experiences I had of going to Guantanamo in 2004 for the first time, even though I began representing them in 2002, it was the first time we were allowed to go to Guantanamo by the government. All that time I had been in the Supreme Court and in the federal courts litigating and fighting for them. I had never met them. I really thought of my client as the rule of law, and that's in many ways what it was and what it is. But when I went to Guantanamo for the first time, I met real people, and they were people who had parents and wives and children, and I realized, especially at that time when they weren't even getting an opportunity to go to court, I realized what that meant. What the rule of law really means is about affecting a real person, a real human being. It's about protecting, a person's integrity and dignity as a human being. And so, I would say that we can talk about them as terrorists, but really until they've had a hearing or a trial, they're just, like you and me, with accusations against them. And many people in America can understand that. They've had accusations against them or been arrested or accused, and in the end, it's not true. So I think we need to really think about that. I think the second piece of going to Guantanamo that I can tell you about is it's not an easy place for anybody. And we have a lot of our troops there doing what they think, doing their job and protecting America. So I think, a lot of people have sort of been down on the, possibly down on the military and talk about Guantanamo in such terrible language. It is a terrible place, but we do have American troops there are really trying to do a good job, and I think that many of them are really trying hard to do a good job.
And the last question I want to ask you really quickly is, we talked about the kind of reputation that Guantanamo and the United States has. Everyone has said, or many people have said, that the war on terror has changed the United States' reputation in the world. What kind of legacy do you think Guantanamo will have on the United States' reputation in the rest of the world?
I think it's difficult for me now to sort of see how it might be viewed historically, although I really hope that we look back and we say, oh, what a terrible thing we did, just like when we, interned the Japanese Americans, that we acted out of haste and out of fear. I really hope that's what it's like. And I sort of do think that, and maybe it's because I'm hopefully a little bit younger, but I've asked people who sort of lived longer than me and had a longer history, and they've assured me that we will look back and we will see this as a time where we strayed from our fundamental values and our moral compass, but that we will get back there and we'll look back at this as a terrible time. I mean, I think it's unfortunate that we haven't learned from our past mistakes, so maybe we can learn from this experience, which I really do believe is a mistake and is wrong.
Well, Christine, I want to thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.